So, this is my radio podcast for my amendments to reform the United Nations. My name is Romero Latore, and this is my YouTube radio podcast. So, there's only audio in this particular podcast. I consider it a radio podcast. So, this particular video is discussing how to reform the United Nations. Every nation on earth should be permanent members of the Security Council. The days of America phasing in the League of Nations into the United Nations and stagnating on the old world current systems is outdated. Because you have the colonial powers, America as the figurehead. Because you got to understand, after World War II, Britain fell as an empire. So America took advantage after they dropped two bombs on Japan and possessed the world's superweapon, the first nuclear weapons. America took advantage of the world with the gold standard, propping up the world reserve currency. And so all the money of the pegging every nation to the gold reserves had to come through the greenback. And then they replaced it with the world petrodollar. Nixon did, and Kissinger. So they monopolized the world order to this day, the American government. As a world sole superpower, they vetoed the assembly like peasant country lands of the world. Even the European regions, they're not permanent members. It's only the colonial powers, America, Britain, and France, that has the majority permanent membership. So it's still colonial power. But at the present tense, especially under the Trump administration, America is alienating Britain and France under the Trump administration, extorting Canada as a commonwealth, Brexiting Britain, subverting the British government, Trump is, and also he subverted the French government with tariffing them into recessions and tariffing the Paris Accords. So, and the rest of the European members of the European Union are peasant lands. They don't have permanent membership at the Security Council, neither does the Global South. It's only, on that side, is only Russia and China. So you have the five superpowers that won World War II controlling the world order. Between America, Britain, and France, and Russia and China. And between the West and the East, there's tug of wars, proxy wars throughout the rest of the world. And so that's why I believe that that system has to be outdated. The white papers of China agrees with me that we, as far as the United Nations, have to allow every nation to sit at that table as permanent members. So I'm glad that China has started the path of the white papers. Because it's not about, America says socialism is bad. No. Socialism started in Europe when Europe was a bunch of kingdoms and the peasants rebelled against the kings, the robber barons, the monarchies. The peasants rebelled to bring upon democracy. That was socialism that freed the whole of Europe from monarchies. It started with the French revolutions, overthrowing the Tsar of Russia. But basically, socialism was the birth of democracy, what we currently know now as parliaments and presidencies of republics. That started through socialism. Because before then, the whole of Europe was a bunch of kingdoms, of aristocrats, of courtiers of kings and kingdoms and queens of Europe. So America thinks, they like to talk down on socialist politics, socialism. Even Social Security and free healthcare is intended to help the masses. But go back to socialism. They say America, socialism is evil. No, it's not. because Washington was socialist. He overthrew the British monarchy in the United States. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, they rebelled against a kingdom. So America is grounded in democracy of socialist rights for the freedom of the peoples. The Bill of Rights was grounded in socialism of the colonies of the Americas. And they rebelled against the crown of Britain. The same for Bolivar in South America, rebelled against the king of Spain. So socialism, currently in America, if you listen to cable news, left wing or right wing, they talk bad about socialism. But they don't got they're deceiving the American people of the birth of democracy. They're doing an injustice when they talk bad about socialism. Because George Washington was a socialist, colonialist. He overthrew the monarchy of Britain in the colonies. So did the French Revolution overthrow King Louis and Queen Antoinette. So did the Bolsheviks overthrow the czars of Russia. And the revolution kept on spreading throughout all the monarchies of Europe. To this day, Britain's monarchy is just a figure, but they don't control the parliament, thanks to the founding fathers and the socialism movement of the Labour Party. So King Charles can't tip the scales of the parliament. He can't interfere with democracy of the parliament. The same goes for Spain. The king of Spain can't tell the parliament of Spain what to do and how to do it. All of that came through the revolutions of the peasants uniting against overrulers of monarchies. And that all was a socialist revolution for the working class. So they make it seem in America like it's taboo to say socialism, knowing that the founding fathers were socialist colonists that rebelled against the monarchy of Britain to be taxed without representation, for the crown to tax the peasants without the peasants having the right to be represented in their colonies. That was an uprising, a socialist colonial colonist of settlers uprising against the crown, trying to subvert the republic to be taxed for a crown of a monarchy. George Washington was a socialist revolutionist. Bolivar, rebelling against the Spanish colonies, was a socialist revolutionist. The French Revolution was socialist when they rebelled against King Louis and Queen Antoinette. The Bolsheviks of Russia were socialists when they rebelled against Tsar Nicholas of Russia. So in America, when you listen to Fox News, CNN, NBC, CBS, and they talk bad about socialism, they make it seem like it's evil, to try to fool the people to listen to their commercials on commercial breaks for capitalism. There's nothing wrong with socialism, because the founding fathers fundamentally were socialist, revolutionist in the colonies of the settlers. In Delaware, and even in Philadelphia when they drafted the Constitution, as peasant colonists in their communes, plotting to liberate themselves from the oppression of a monarchy. So there's nothing wrong with saying socialism, because those founding fathers started the republic that we call now today the United States, under the Bill of Rights, that all human beings are created equal with unalienable rights under the oppression of a monarchy. That's what they drafted that letter for. That document is to say that one man on earth can't enslave us with their crowns. That was the whole point of the revolution, the American Revolution inside the United States. So you lose track of that when you listen at the present day. If you was to turn on Fox News, cable television in America, if you was to turn on CNN, NBC, CBS, MS Now, they talk about socialism like it's something evil. Like if you're cursing through your mouth when you say the word socialism, like it's something bad. Social Security, socialism. Free universal health care to ensure that society is taken care of. That you won't be turned down when you're suffering from diseases just because you don't have a penny in your pocket. That the government will step in to make sure that you don't die because you don't have money when it comes to health care. These laws are intended for the Bill of Rights, that all humans are created equal with unalienable rights, no matter if you're rich or poor. So, knowing that the Founding Fathers were revolting against a crown of one man imprisoning them as peasant colonists, when they united in the Commune to ratify social revolts and created the revolution that is grounded in socialism. So when this country, as a world superpower, tells the rest of the country on earth that America has total veto power to submit the world order to the whims of Washington, corrupt officials, for capitalism run amok, especially under the Trump era. When the colonial powers, even France and Britain, Trump is extorting them into submission. But they were basically the colonial powers that to this day they try to monopolize the Western-led order inside the United Nations. And it's not fair for the rest of the European members neither. Because they're not seated at the table as permanent members neither, along with the peasant lands of the global south. So that's why I want the United Nations to reform. I want every nation on earth to be permanent members of the Security Council. Every nation on earth to be permanent members of the Security Council, where every nation has their sovereign votes as permanent members. So when the world-based rules, international laws, are accorded, it will be the will of all nations on earth. Not just one nation like it exists today of America as a world superpower, redoing the whole world into submission like the United Nations is a peasant assembly of nations. That backward thinkingness has to get eradicated as far as the United Nations, the way it's chartered today. So it needs to be reformed. So I am calling for all nations on earth, including Palestine, to be recognized as a nation. That's another thing. The conflict that's going on now with the genocide on the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, I don't want Trump or Jared nowhere in the Gaza Strip. This is not a commonwealth for the Trump family, the Gaza Strip. I want his charter revoked, the Board of Peace revoked, because now Trump is trying to pillage and plunder the wealth of nations. He was trying to take Iran oil. He took Venezuela's oil. He was trying to take Greenland to mine the mineral rights of Greenland and Canada and control the passage of pipelines of gas and oil pipelines that throughout the United States to run to the Canadian territory to make Europe dependent on America as a world superpower, while he extorts them with tariffs and undermines NATO and the European Union to weaken them as a middle power. While the rest of the European Union is not even sat at the table as permanent members, as well as the rest of the nations on earth. So this imperial world so superpower order has to come to an end. For the sake of all nations on earth, to be liberated equally at the table, to be set globally democratically at the table of the leagues of all nations. It started from the League of Nations and then it turned into the United Nations, but it's not a democratic world order. It's not a democratic world order. And to every nation is set at the table equally. So when every nation is permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations, it will be a unanimous vote to outlaw nuclear weapons in times of war for all nuclear armed nations. 100% disarmament nuclear armed weapons for all nuclear armed nations. It will be outlawed for any nation to use nuclear weapons in times of war. It will be outlawed globally for any army on earth to use nuclear weapons in the midst of war. It will be considered outlawed. So that'll be the first vote of the Security Council when every nation becomes permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations. Is to ratify 100% unanimous votes of all nations on earth to globally outlaw any nation possessing nuclear weapons and using it in times of war. So that'll be the first amendment to be passed into international accords. Now there's other amendments that I want to bring to the United Nations Security Council of all nations on earth. I will want the world to live in peacetime and not in war. So I am proposing that when any conflict breaks out into war between one nation or another, against one nation or another, it has to be voted by the Security Council. It has to be sanctioned by the Security Council majority votes. So a threshold of 95% of all nations on earth will have to sanction any conflict from ever breaking out, for whatever reasons, between one nation's army and another nation's army, in times of regional conflict or country against country conflicts. That will have to be a unanimous vote of 95% of all nations on earth sanctioning intervention forces, allowing one nation or organization of nations to resolve in military conflicts. But let me state again that the probabilities of that being sanctioned is slim to none. Of 95% of all nations voting to use or resort to military violence. So that means, in turn, that there will be more global peace than global wars. Because instead of resolving your issues with war, y'all will resolve it in peace before y'all break out and resort to violence. So that'll be the second amendment that I'll pass, that I'll bring to the floor for the nations on earth to vote it into passing it into law. So that's the amendments that I will propose for the United Nations permanent members of all nations on earth as Security Council members. These will be the first on the dockets to be voted on as far as global accords. So the way I see it, if we can resolve our issues, international conflicts, disputes, and resolute it with the unanimous votes of all nations peacefully, most likely there will be more peace on earth. In return, humanity will be more prosperous, more developed, and more secured in peacetime than to be weakened in wartime. Because when 95% of all nations on earth resolve their issues peacefully, majority of times that will happen when cooler heads prevail with majorities of good conscious nations uniting together to keep all nations peaceful. See, that's what's wrong with the systems of the United Nations today. You got a bottleneck of 5 permanent members and a tug of war between the West and the East. And ever since the United Nations ratification of the Charter after World War II, there's always been proxy wars, cold wars between the West and the East throughout the rest of the world, whether it be in South America, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, Europe. There's always been conflicts because of this system that was inept to deal with the world order as 5 permanent members. To this day, there's wars throughout the world because of it. And millions and millions and millions and millions of human being innocents have perished in the name of war. And they cannot be condoned any further. So by having 95% of all nations on earth keep the world peaceful, that means that humanity will be shepherded in peacetime. Than to fall prey to destruction. And ever since the Charter of the United Nations, after the conclusion of World War II, there's been proxy wars because of that. The atrocities of civilians, of hundreds of regional conflicts throughout the world has killed millions and millions and millions of human beings. To this system that was inept from the first day that it was conscribed as the Charter of the United Nations between the East and the West of the 5 permanent members. Cold wars, proxy wars, and the world can't stand it no more. The rest of the nations on earth cannot stand it no more. So I, with my Second Amendment, am proposing that 95% trash voting rules to resolve issues peacefully than to resort to violence, military violence. So that means if any nation is disputing with any other nation on earth, that the Security Council will deal with it and resolute it, because to go to war, you will need to pass 95% threshold votes to go to war. And the likelihood of you landing be past 95% majority rules of all nations on earth will be slim to none as far as going to war. So that means majority of all conflicts, disputes will be resolved in peacetime. So these are the first 2 amendments I want to propose for the New World Order and the reformation of the United Nations. The third reform that I want to propose to vote into international accords is to do away with global taxation for every nation on earth. To do away with global taxation for every nation on earth and everybody on earth. That means if you work hard for your money, you keep 100% of your earnings. Nobody should put their hands in your pockets to rob your sweat, blood, and tears. Taxation is a form of enslavement. If you work for yours and you earn an honest wage, you keep 100% of your earnings. So I want to ratify globally abolishing the taxation systems of all nations on earth, for everybody on earth. And when it comes to nations being able to provide for their populations, for every country to be able to provide for their citizenry, populations of their countries, of all nations on earth, every nation should have the right to print their fiscal budget free of debt to provide for their populations. When it comes to free universal health care, when it comes to Social Security retirement pension plans, when it comes to highways and bridges and roads and utility, water supply, electric supply, when it comes to emergency response as fire departments and police departments, every government on earth, that's your responsibilities to safeguard and provide for your populations. The government obligations, which is free universal health care, retirement pension plans, Social Security for the retirees and people with disabilities, and to make sure that you have infrastructures that are not crumbling, like highways, bridges, utilities, water supplies, electrical grids, to rise your populations and your nations to a first world status as far as infrastructures, to rise the third world up from poverty. As far as the obligations that I just mentioned, that every nation's bureaucracies of every nation's seat of government should be able to print their fiscal budget free of debt to provide these governmental responsibilities and obligations to their populations. Free of debt, that means that the government can plan, every government on earth can plan for their yearly fiscal budget free of debt. That means they can print their budgets, fund their budgets, and then cancel their debts out of thin air without any financial debt burdens on the government budgets of every nation on earth. Because money, if you think about it, money is just a paper, a medium of exchange. You can print anything. Paper, paper is just paper. It's worthless. It's a concept. An analogy is when you go to the bathroom, you wipe your, you know what, with toilet paper, right? Do you discard that as a medium of exchange? Because money comes from the same thing, paper. So why do we place a overvalue on paper? In other words, the government shouldn't be able to starve their peoples and then be bankrupt because they think that paper is worth something, which is a tragedy on humanity. To think that paper is worth its weight in gold. It's a concept that is illogical. So what I'm proposing is for every government, since you control your central banks, to print your paper money free of debt, to provide for your governmental obligations to your populations. That means you don't got to sell treasury bonds, security bills, to provide for your populations. Y'all have your central banks. Y'all can print as much allocated budgets and then cancel your debts when y'all finish your obligations. Free of debt. Without being enslaved because of it. The people vote you into office to protect the well-being of society as government officials. So your obligations are to the people. for the people, by the people. Point blank, period. No ifs and buts about it. So when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to free universal health care for everyone, when it comes to retirement pensions guaranteed for everyone that retires or people with disabilities, when it comes to emergency response, fire departments, police departments, when it comes to water supply, when it comes to electric energy supplies, even free education, high education, college education, when it comes to getting degrees, Ivy League degrees, that should be free of charge. You shouldn't be able to be kept away from a college because you can't afford to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for your degree. That's a tragedy. As the way it exists now when it comes to Ivy League colleges. If you want to learn, you can learn, and you shouldn't be afforded not to learn because you can't afford to pay a heavy premium. So all of these services will be provided by the government for the government, free of debt to the population and free of debt to the government. Because they can print their fiscal budgets and then build and fulfill their fiscal responsibilities and then cancel their debts once they fulfill their obligations. So they don't have to sell and enslave themselves with the taxation system as government officials or as citizens of the land, of all nations and every nation on earth. So abolitionary of the whole global taxation system. So these are the first amendments that I am drafting for the New World Order and the reformation of the United Nations.